So for today, I would like to first shortly introduce USB. Then I would like to go to our future building volume forecasts, and then finally look at some key trends we see in the construction industry. As said, this will be the first webinar which provides a little bit of a broader overview. For future editions, we want to focus on individual topics like prefabrication or BIM, and make it more interactive with some guest speakers. So let's start with the introduction of USB. So who are we? Well, we are a market research agency. Specializing in the construction, installation, and home improvement market segments, active in the market for over 30 years with a team of approximately 70 people. We basically have two business areas. One is doing dedicated tailor-made market research, and the other one is focusing on providing our customers with ready-made reports off the shelf. Now, these ready-made reports off the shelf, they focus on target groups: architects, contractors, installers, painters, handymen. But the key thing for all of these researches is that they are based on quantitative market research. So we do, for example, 3,400 interviews with architects on an annual basis, and bringing out quarterly reports on key topics like orientation behavior, building information modeling, sustainability, and so on. So for this presentation, I'll be leaning heavily on the results from the European Architectural Barometer and Contractor Monitor, but also left and right from the Painters Insight Monitor and the Handyman Monitor. So whom are we working for? Well, we work throughout the business value chain. As I said, we are specializing in construction, installation, and home improvement. Here you can find a selection of customers whom we are working for. Now let's start with the actual presentation, the future building forecast. Of course, a lot of companies clearly see that the construction industry is slowing down this year. But the question is, what will happen in the upcoming years? So whenever we are trying to look further than, let's say, a year, we try to look at some early indicators. And one of these early indicators are architects. European architects are in the early cycle of the business value chain. And if they see changes in, for example, their order book, this means less volume in 2 years' time, more or less. So if we look on a European level at the order books from architects and how they developed, we clearly see that after a peak, let's say in 2021, there's a slow and gradual decrease in the order books compared to the year before. But we see a real, let's say, more negative development in the third quarter of 2022 and in the fourth quarter of 2022. And this will impact, of course, the year we are in right now. What we do see is that slowly but steadily, the order books are improving slightly. Now, if we take a look at the various countries, we can see that the drop in order book at architects are especially visible in Poland, the Netherlands, and the UK. There it is, let's say, on a negative level compared to a year ago for quite some time. But we also see some other countries where we see a stronger drop. Now, if we look at a different stakeholder, the European contractors, so general builders, and we ask them about their turnover. How do they see their turnover developing? And we are looking now at the first year, 2023. We can clearly see that the contractors, all except for Poland, have become more negative in their turnover development. So in all countries, the turnover for general builders, except for Poland, was more negative than the year before. Now, we also ask them about their outlooks, their expectations. Luckily, their expectations, in this case, it was the expectations for the second half of the year, this year, 2023, they became more positive. Even though in some countries it's still negative, like in Germany, it improved compared to the first half year, 2023. And if we look at their order books do remain on quite a high level. It's quite interesting. You do see in many countries the drop in order book, but afterwards there's a upwards motion. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the market is growing, because we will find out in a couple of minutes that things like labor shortage really impact the order book of all of the stakeholders, including contractors. Now, before I jump to the actual predictions, how good are they? So we are making predictions based on the order book developments at architects, contractors, installers. We look at building permits, production levels, GDP, everything basically we can find. And we have been forecasting since 2008, and we started to plot our forecasts versus the actual reported output via Eurostat. And of course, if we look backwards, look at the predictions we made, and once the Eurostat data is available, we start comparing, we can clearly see that our forecast model is actually really good at forecasting the overall volumes that are in the construction industry growing or declining. So let's start with this year. And with this year is 2023, we compare it to 2022. And if we look at the predictions we have for this year, it is negative in most countries. It's negative in UK, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland. The only two countries where we do see a more positive development compared to 2022 are Spain and Italy. Now, why is it important to mention that this is compared to 2022? Well, 2022 was, of course, a year where we had a very high peak of construction volume. So 2023, clearly in almost all countries, is not as great as 2022. Now, there are some key reasons why we see this decline in total production volume in the construction industry. First of all, we see higher interest rates. And these higher interest rates mean higher finance costs. And this is really hurting the construction industry, but especially the new build part, as it's harder to get the finance fixed, but also, for example, for end consumers, when it's a new build residential, it's much harder for them to get the investments they need to buy a house. So it leads to higher investment costs. Furthermore, we have a very high labor shortage in the European market. This also leads to a higher cost of construction. There's another element that increases the cost of construction. This is the higher material prices. And with higher material prices, we see higher construction material costs. So these three elements are really responsible for making new build, especially new build, much more expensive, but also in the renovation market. Another thing we clearly see is that there's more uncertainty in the market about the general economic developments. And whenever we see uncertainty in the, let's say, general economy, it always has a negative impact on the construction industry historically. And finally, I already mentioned it, we are comparing, at least for 2023, we are comparing with 2022, which was a peak year where we see the almost in all countries the highest production volumes in the construction industry. So we need to bear that in mind. But overall, we see a very negative development for 2023. Now, is it just dark clouds all out? No, because our predictions for 2024 are much more positive. It's also more positive than many other industry experts that are providing their prognosis. We clearly see that if we compare 2024 with 2023, that there is much more positive development in all countries except for Germany. We do need to realize again that we are comparing here 2024 with 2023. And as you already saw in 2023, the market has decreased. So the fact that it's increasing now, you need to bear in mind it's increasing after a decrease. But the only country where we still report a further negative growth of the production volumes in construction is Germany with a minus of 1.5%. Now, except for Germany, we see an increase in growth again. And why do we see this? What are the reasons behind? Well, first and foremost, we see that there still is a huge housing shortage, especially in Northern Europe, and then especially affordable housing. Now, the amount of new build permits for residential has dropped in many countries. but it's not something that is sustainable. At some point, we need to start building again. And we think that this will already happen in 2024. But we also see that the renovation market was not impacted that strongly. In most countries, the share of renovation, let's say in the total production of the construction industry, has increased. New build has decreased. And we think that the renovation market will continue to provide a growth for the overall construction industry. Furthermore, the market is still converging more and more towards urbanization. And with urbanization, 9 out of 10 times more buildings are needed as more people are flocking to, let's say, urbanized areas. Last but not least, we also see that the increased attention towards sustainability, the energy efficiency, making houses or the existing building stocks more energy efficient will drive further growth for the total construction industry. So just to recap, we clearly see that 2023 was not a good year when it comes to the construction industry and the volumes that are produced. 2024 looks much more positive, except for Germany. Now, I promised to look at some key trends. I would almost call them mega trends, the big trends, overarching trends we see impacting the construction industry. And I would like to focus on 4 of them. There are, of course, many more, but we do not have enough time. And for future webinars, we think about maybe focusing much more on a single trend to provide more in-depth information. For now, we will just have a helicopter view on labor shortage, prefabrication, digitalization, and sustainability. These are the 4 topics I would like to discuss with you today. And why these 4? They have a profound impact on the construction industry, and they are long-term trends. These are trends that have been ongoing in many cases already for a decade at least, and they will continue to shape the construction industry for the upcoming decade as well. Now, obviously, there are many other interesting trends in the market. For example, robotization, Internet of Things, AI, 3D printing. So what about these trends? Well, I think you can categorize them under these overarching trends. Robotization, consequence of labor shortage. Internet of Things, AI, part of the increased digitalization in the construction industry. And 3D printing, you could categorize as a form of prefab. In upcoming webinars, maybe we can focus on these topics in more detail. But for now, I would like to start with the first topic at hand, which is labor shortage. Now, for me, labor shortage is perhaps the biggest problem or blocker in the construction installation industry, even also for the home improvement industry. And one key thing to note first and foremost is that labor productivity in the construction industry hasn't increased significantly over time. It remained relatively flat, especially if you compare this with, let's say, the global industry, so fast-moving consumer goods, automotive, everything combined. So the first thing we need to note, productivity levels haven't increased significantly over time. Secondly, the workforce we do have available to us is quite old in Europe. And that just is a consequence of the demographic buildup of the European society. There is a very large percentage of older people in Europe compared to younger people. So our pyramid is out of shape. And why is this important? Well, this means that the labor pool that is available will decrease for the construction industry. Now, how bad is it? What do we already see in the market? And we've asked our, let's say, core target groups, to what degree are you facing or are you hindered by labor shortage in the execution of your projects? So let's start with architects. The architects in the Netherlands are the ones with the highest problems with labor shortage. Almost 7 out of 10 architects state that they are hindered by labor shortage in the execution of their projects. It's the lowest in Italy, with about a quarter of architects mentioning labor shortage as a problem. Looking at general builders, are more or less the same. Almost 7 out of 10 contractors mention labor shortage is a serious problem. It's again the lowest in Italy, with about 18%. If we look at installers, Germany pops up. 3/4 of all installers in Germany state that they are faced with severe labor shortages. It's again the lowest in Italy, but this is relatively low because still almost 4 out of 10 installers also are faced with labor shortage. Now, if we look at painters, for example, there we see that again in Germany, the highest labor shortage is present, with almost 9 out of 10 painters stating that labor shortage is a problem. It's again the lowest in Italy, but again here the lowest is relatively speaking because almost half of all of the painters in Italy also mention labor shortage. And the problems in the future will only intensify. I already explained that we have a very high average age in the construction industry. And if you look at painters, for example, and you look at the build-up, you see that the share of baby boomers, so older than 58, is still relatively large in most countries, especially in the Netherlands and the UK. These will outflow quite quickly, but also the share of Generation X is quite high. And again, this group will also outflow, or parts of them, in the upcoming decade. The big problem is Generation Y is really only a small part of the total population. So the inflow of new people is not as big as it should be. Now, the consequences of labor shortage are severe for the construction industry. It leads to higher labor cost, and this will lead to increases in the cost of construction, which are already on the high side at the moment. Now, capacity problems will arise because of this labor shortage. And we see that capacity problems will also result in longer lead times and can hinder things like the sustainable transition. It's really great that we want to make our existing building stock more sustainable, but if we do not have the hands or the capacity to do that, this transition will be severely hindered by the labor shortage problem. What we also see from our researches is that if stakeholders in the construction business value chain, like contractors, are faced with high labor shortage and high work pressure, they start focusing on short-term production, but not on long-term improvements of their productivity. So basically, they just start working in the same way, and they start to invest less in getting more production and higher level of efficiency. And last but not least, we can also expect that with the outflow of highly qualified people and the inflow of less qualified people, we will have a qualitative labor shortage, which will further reduce the productivity due to the fact that they are less skilled. Now, what do we expect for the future? Well, for the future, we expect that the problems with labor shortage will persist and will not be resolved. Why is that? It's just first and foremost simple demographic. Demographics will work against resolving the labor shortage issue, as in the upcoming decade or so, we will see a very high outflow of the older generation of construction workers. This should not be a big problem if we can increase the inflow, but initiatives to do this has been mildly successful at best. And labor shortage is not only present in the construction industry, but also, for example, in hospitality, healthcare. So there's a lot of, let's say, focus on this younger generation, and a lot of industries are trying to attract them. And finally, we have the development that in countries, for example, Eastern Europe, which are normally supplying construction laborers, they are starting to be faced with labor shortage in their own countries. So more and more construction workers decide to stay in their own countries. What we can also see is that buildings and constructions are getting more and more complicated. And this complexity, of course, is driven by more sustainability, more prefab, and the fact that we will also have a qualitative labor shortage will increase the overall labor shortage problem, because they will become less productive. But we will also see that eventually this labor shortage will result in more innovation and more opportunities, like mechanical applications, 3D printing, robotics, digitalization, and of course, prefabrication. Now, if we look at prefabrication, and we ask the European contractors in what percentage of their projects some form of prefab is applied, we already see that in Europe the numbers are quite high. In the Netherlands, for example, in 71% of all projects from contractors, prefab or some form of prefab is applied. It's the lowest in the UK, France, and Spain, relatively speaking. And after the Netherlands, it's high in Belgium, Germany, Poland, and Italy. Now, if we ask the question to the European architects, we see a similar image, but with just overall a little less percentage of the projects where prefab is applied. Now, when we look at prefab, we see something very interesting happening. That is, in 2022, we asked the contractors what percentage of your projects contain some form of prefab. So this is the European overview. It increased from 32% in 2018 to 41% in 2022. But their expectations for 2025, in fact, are lower. 35% of all projects containing some form of prefab. And then they expect to see an increase again in 2030. So the short-term outlook for prefab in the total project mix is decreasing, although according to the contractors increasing again longer term. The architects, we asked in 2021 this question, and we will repeat this question for next year. But there we see that compared to 2019, there was not a big growth in the percentage of projects containing some form of prefab. Just like the contractors, they do expect to see the share of prefab growing again in 2025 and 2030. So this is quite interesting to see. And if you ask, well, why is that? Well, the main reason is that the market was shifting already more towards renovation and less to new build. And in renovation, less prefab is applied. Now, we do see the prefab market becoming more mature, if you can call it this way. Why? Well, the share of more advanced systems, so prefabricated panelized systems, that's prefab with some form of insulation or finishing applied, is growing compared to 2018. And there's also a small growth for prefabricated modular building. What we also see is that prefab now is mostly applied to low-rise construction. But if you ask the contractors for their future expectations, they clearly see a big increase, 3% now to 12% in the future for high-rise. Also mid-rise will increase from 14% now to 21% in the future. So prefab will be applied in more projects in terms of the height of the buildings. And what we also see is that wood-based materials are increasing, especially when it comes to the facade, pitch roof, flat roofs, and to a lesser degree the ceilings. So wood-based solutions are gaining volume in the prefab market. Still, concrete is dominant in many aspects, but wood is increasing its market share. In this case, I looked at modular, but we also, of course, see the same development at prefabricated single elements or panelized systems. Now, what do we expect to see in the future? Well, the future for prefab does look bright. Labor shortage will inevitably drive the market towards more prefab. And we will also see higher levels of industrialization of prefab. So not just off-site construction, what you would normally do on-site, but really full prefabricated modules being built in factories. And this will improve the benefits of using prefab. And we also see that the increase in digitalization will facilitate and accommodate more complex prefabricated designs. Now, of course, I say here increase in digitalization, and I will now show you that this is happening in the market. Now, BIM usage among architects has already reached the, let's say, early majority of architects and is expected to increase even further. In 2021, on a European level, 44% of all architects were BIM users. And the expectancies is that this will grow to 61% in 2025. Now, one thing to point out, which is really important with building information modeling, is that there are quite significant differences per country. For example, in the Netherlands, 8 out of 10 architects are using BIM, compared to only 22% in Italy, and all of the other countries are somewhere in between. Now, there's also a lot of country differences when it comes to LOD levels, but if we look at LOD levels on a European level, we clearly see that, at least from an architectural perspective, LOD levels are not that familiar. and the level of detail that is being specified the most is 300. Now, we've been focusing on architects, but what about other stakeholders? Well, if we look at contractors, we see the share of BIM users at 12%, so that's a significant drop. If we look at installers, both HVAC or electrical installers, it's even less, 7 and 6%. Now, this has to do, of course, with the fact that the architects are the early adopters, and then the other stakeholders lower down the business value chain adopt more slowly. But one thing that's clearly important, and we look at installers here to note, is that size matters when it comes to BIM. So the smaller companies are almost never using BIM, but the bigger companies are using BIM much more. And this is really important to understand. Now, what do we expect in the future when it comes to digitalization and BIM? Also here, the future looks really bright. We think that BIM usage will continue its increase as it's slowly adapted through lower levels of the business value chain. There are two reasons for that. One, for example, contractors are forced to work with BIM as more and more architects are making their designs in BIM, but also new software, which is easier to use, cheaper to use, makes using BIM more accessible. Also, a lot of manufacturers are supporting their contractors, installers, when they need to work in a BIM project. Now, higher levels of prefab usage and the need for a more efficient building process will also increase the usage of BIM. We see a direct relation between the level of BIM usage and the prefab usage. Now, there are also a lot of pressures, both internal, reducing failure cost, which is very important at this time, and external pressures, legislation, that will continue to drive a higher adoption of BIM. And last but not least, we see that when it comes to higher demands for sustainability, like tracking the material, also after the building meets its end of life, reusing, life cycle analysis, and so on, those things can be done in BIM really well and are also driving BIM adoption. So speaking of sustainability, our last topic for our webinar today, we clearly see that the construction insulation market is getting a lot of attention when it comes to sustainability. And this is not unmerited, as it is a big polluter. For example, if you add building operations and building and materials construction together, this represents almost 40% of all global CO2 emissions. So the fact that the industry is getting a lot of attention, well, that's quite merited. But even with all of the attention, the willingness to pay is not on the levels we saw in 2018. We asked the architects, in this case, to what extent do your clients ask for sustainability? And here's the important part, and are they willing to invest in more to achieve this? So in 2018, about 36% of all of the clients of architects were willing to invest in sustainability. This dropped in 2020 to only 20%. And now we see a steadily increase, and in 2023, 31% of all clients of architects are asking for sustainability and are willing to invest. Approximately 20% is not asking for it at all, and 48% is asking for it, but not willing to invest. If we take a look at contractors, we see more or less the same image. About 30% of the clients of architects are asking for sustainability and are willing to invest. Now, if we look at the share of clients that are not asking for sustainability, this is significantly higher than with the architects. But still, the willingness to invest is on a comparable level. And another thing that contractors and architects share is what they see as big problems for the transition towards a sustainable and circular construction industry. So we put some statements before them, and they could answer big problem, small problem, no problem. And the number 1 and 2 are related to legislations and regulation that inhibit and are not stimulating, and inefficient knowledge, inefficient awareness, the lack of uniformity when it comes to measuring sustainability. If you look at the demand side in the market or the supply side, this is far less of a problem. It is more related to legislation and regulation that inhibit and not stimulate, and, let's say, lacks in knowledge and awareness. Now, I would also like to focus on two, let's say, relatively new sustainable initiatives. For example, first, environmental product declarations, EPDs. We asked architects, are you familiar with those? 42% said yes. Then, if they said yes, we asked them, do you make use of it? 58% said yes. And the ones that use it, they do find it very helpful for implementing their own projects in a more circular way. 72% says yes, it adds value. But one important thing to note is that almost 60% of the architects flat out say they are not familiar with the term environmental product declaration or do not have sufficient knowledge on that. Another one, for example, material passports, we see more or less a similar image. 44% is familiar, 44% uses material passports if they are familiar with it, and about 66% say that it adds value to make their projects more circular or sustainable. So again, a larger share that is unfamiliar, but if they are familiar, they tend to use it quite often and they do see the added value. Now, finally, before concluding on sustainability, and we also ask them what are innovative products or solutions with regard to sustainable and circular construction that are already being used. We ask this again to the architects. And we have the top 10 here, but the top 3 is bio-based insulation, solar panels, and recycled and reused materials. So really interesting to see what they feel are innovative products that are already being used when it comes to sustainable and circular construction. So what are our expectations when it comes to sustainability? Well, the sustainability development or sustainability train, the direction we're all rolling into, will not be stopped. That's one thing for sure. But what we think is that it might not be going as quickly as everybody's expecting. But let's start with why this sustainability train will not be stopped. First and foremost, legislation, overall increased attention towards sustainability will lead to more demand. And we already see the demand increasing. Furthermore, we have the energy transition, which will really push the market forward at a greater pace than ever before. But as I already said, it might not be going as quick as expected. Why is that? Well, the high cost of construction is really a blocker here. Again, you can break it down. Labor costs are higher, material cost, interest rates. This is slowing down the willingness to invest and thus the adoption rate. So this concludes the presentation on the key trends in the construction, our first open webinar.